March 25th, 1420. A column of Hussite pilgrims traveled through Bohemia towards their home commune, Tabor. The column numbered some 400 people, including women and children, and 12 wagons. Among their leaders was the one-eyed Jan Žižka. Nearby the village of Sudomer, the column noticed something that worried them deeply. All around them, knights on horseback emerged from the woods. These were Royalists, sworn to root out all Hussite rebels. Outnumbered up to 5-1 with barely any combat-ready troops, Žižka understood the Royalists would not accept a surrender. He ordered his people to take up defensive positions. They would soon have to fight to the death. I want to thank Raid Shadow Legends for sponsoring this video. If you enjoy these military history documentaries and like gaming, Raid Shadow Legends might be a good fit for you. The game has over 600 playable characters, all part of unique factions. For example, take the High Elves faction. Their backstory is interesting. Their homeland, Aravia, has been around for thousands of years, surviving the fall of the Lizardman Empire, helping the humans form into civilizations and defeating the orcs when they formed a huge horde and attacked the continent. For example, take this one named Jingle Hunter. And this month, Raids got a non-stop schedule of special events and activities, including Forge Pass Season 3 with a limited edition artifact set. Raids also is bringing out awesome champion skins for Madame Ceres. And later this month, Death Knight is finally becoming a legendary champion. This is the best time to get started in Raid, and if you click my link in the description or scan my QR code on screen, you will get unique bonuses worth $30 if you're a new player and sign up in the next 30 days. We're talking about Aina, 200,000 silver, 1 energy refill and 1 XP boost and 1 ancient shard. All this treasure will be waiting for you here. When in July 1419 Czech Hussites threw Catholic members of the Prague City Council out of the window of a town hall, very few expected 17 years of bloody warfare to follow. These so-called Hussite Wars brought forth several Czech national heroes. Among them was Jan Žižka, a great general and strategist. He withstood several crusades sent against him by King Sigismund of Hungary. Against all odds and always heavily outnumbered, Žižka used modern tactics such as armored battle wagons to take on much larger armies. Early on during the war, he was fully blinded, yet he commanded his forces for 4 more years. Not much is known about Jan Žižka's early life. He was born around 1360 in Troknov, a town in southern Bohemia. He was born to a poor family who worked the land between Budovic and Krumlov, owned by the mighty Bohemian Rosenberg family. Because Troknov was close to current-day Austria, Žižka grew up in a bilingual culture, speaking both Czech and German. Jan thanked his nickname Žižka to losing his eye. Sources conflict on whether he lost it during a fight in childhood or one of the first actual battles as a mercenary. The court of King Wenceslaus IV of Bohemia employed Žižka as a royal hunter in Zahorani, near the royal castle of Orlik. In 1405, probably already in his 40s, he abandoned the king's service and joined the band of mercenaries. When he returned 4 years later, King Wenceslaus pardoned him and employed him in his army. As part of a Bohemian force, Žižka participated in the significant 1410 Battle of Grunwald, pitting the Teutonic Knights against the Kingdom of Poland and Grand Duchy of Lithuania. Undoubtedly, Žižka's military skills were honed, tested, and tried by the combat he had seen so far. According to official documents from Prague's court register, Žižka bought a house in the capital in 1414, married a woman, and had a daughter who died in infancy. 2 years later, he sold his house and was once again employed at the royal court. Now, while all this was happening, another man caused shock waves through religious Europe. Rector at Prague University, Jan Hus, stood at the forefront of the Bohemian Reformation. It is likely Žižka heard Hus preach during his stay in Prague. Hus opposed the sale of indulgences, becoming one of its most vocal critics. As a result, the Pope excommunicated him, demanding his church to be burned down. Hus went into voluntary exile, producing many writings and gathering a large following of different social layers, all attracted to his open-air sermons. In 1414, Hus was invited to the conference of Constance to present his ideas. Lured under false pretenses as King Sigismund of Hungary promised him safe passage, he was arrested and burned at the stake when he arrived. Hus became a martyr, and his following was understandably outraged. This contributed to the ever-increasing powder keg Bohemia was sitting on. Bohemian nobles began publicly demanding the curbing of corruption among the clergy and the prohibition of indulgences and altering religious rituals such as drinking wine at Holy Communion. Bohemian priests who refused to allow both forms of ritual were chased from their churches. These Hussites referred to themselves as ultraquists, with the chalice of wine becoming their symbol. Sporadic massacres against Hussites and Catholics took place for the next few years. Then, 3 years later, the newly elected Pope Martin V decided he wanted to curb Bohemian unrest. Using King Sigismund's influence over his half-brother Wenceslaus, the latter was told he should take action against the Hussites. When Wenceslaus announced measures against Hussites, a protest march to Prague's town hall led to the so-called First Defenestration of Prague. In July 1419 that year, city council members were thrown out of the window. 1 month later, King Wenceslaus died, supposedly due to shock. Sigismund quickly seized the opportunity to proclaim himself as King of Bohemia, albeit without coronation. Considering him responsible for Hus's death and the entire mess, Hussites rose up in arms. The famous 4 Articles of Prague were drawn up in a program Žižka defended and referred to until his death. In short, the 4 points were that there should be freedom to preach the word of God, the celebration of communion should allow both kinds, the clergy's property should be confiscated, and punishment for sins should be followed through regardless of social standing. Still, these articles had different interpretations, with Žižka being one of the most radical interpreters. Around this time, Žižka rose to prominence in Bohemia's incredibly complicated political area. There were several split-offs from the Hussites. Žižka joined the so-called Taborites, named after the biblical Mount Tabor. They were an apocalyptical branch who, throughout the war, would often be at odds with the moderate ultraquists. After the defenestration, royal forces did everything they could to fortify Prague, increase garrisons, root out and execute Hussites, and barricade entrances. Still, Hussites managed to capture the royal castle Vyšehrad. The fighting now spread through Prague, with eventually just 2 castles under Royalist control. Things got heated to the degree both parties negotiated a peace, and Sigismund guaranteed Hussite worship if the Taborites retreated and returned the castle. Now, they did so, albeit against Žižka's wishes. Upon learning of the return of the castle, Žižka and his men traveled to the town of Pilsen, but around the country royalist forces began persecuting Hussite communities. For example, in Kutna Hora, nearly all Hussites were massacred. Rumors reached Žižka about massacres around Pilsen. When Pope Martin V issued a bull calling for the extermination of all Hussites and other heresies, Žižka decided to move to an old strategic fortress, which they renamed Tabor. Žižka, together with 12 wagons, a cannon, and a group of 400 loyal rebels, women and children, made their way to Tabor. The column planned to travel towards Tabor via Sudomer. Local Catholics informed regional royalist commanders about the group's departure, despite the immunity guarantee. Boguslav von Swamberg and his Landfried soldiers trailed the group throughout their journey. On March 25th, Boguslav's force was augmented by knights of the Johannite order. With these extra soldiers, the royalist army numbered up to 2,500 men. They agreed to attack and to wipe out the column that same day. Several contemporary sources about the battle survive. It is generally assumed that although Žižka participated, Brenek Svihovsky of Dolan commanded the army. Žižka was his second in command. The column traveled between the ponds Markovec and Skaredi to the southeast of Sudomer. The much larger royalist army surrounded them at a certain point. The column's initial response was to hoist a white flag. However, Boguslav and his men did not consider that to make a difference. Between 2,000 and 2,500 Royalist cavalry ambushed the column. When the Hussite commanders realized the Royalists would not accept their surrender, they saw no other option but to find suitable ground for defense. Žižka managed to goad his troops in a defensive position, with the left flank resting against a pond. He ordered the other side to place the dozen wagons so they formed a wall on a slight elevation. Žižka and the few troops carrying arquebuses manned this flank. Around 1,000 Knights Hospitallers launched the first attack. Their assault against the wagons was incredibly costly and not very successful. Chronicles mention how the first line of knights did not even reach the chariot wall. They were fired on by the arquebuses. Nearly all knights perished and the second line suddenly became the vanguard. Thanks to the barricades, the heavy cavalry could not cross the wagons. The arquebusiers picked them off. When the second line did come close enough for a melee, the Hussites used lances and flails to fend off the knights. War wagons did not defend part of the Hussite formation. Seeing the trouble the wagons caused, another 1,000 Royalist horsemen launched an attack against the undefended flank. However, the marshy terrain meant the horses were unable to traverse the distance. During their charge, the horsemen dismounted and continued their attack on foot. But the heavy armor dragged them down, and whereas armor provided an excellent defense when mounted, now the light Hussite infantry counterattacked and flocked the impaired knights. The Hussites engaged the knights in combat using clubs, swords and flails. Thanks to the soggy terrain, the heavy armor prevented the knights from fighting in an agile manner. Both sides sustained heavy losses. During the melee, Brennek was slain. Still, despite the surviving chronicles lauding the Hussites, the knights put up a spirited fight. This was exemplified by the fact the battle lasted until the onset of dusk. Then, as darkness set in, both sides disengaged. The Royalists, forced to retreat, captured 30 prisoners during the battle. The fact Žižka's force contained many ordinary men, women and children made their victory all the more impressive. They lost 3 wagons and their casualty numbers are reported to be heavy, according to chronicles. The Battle of Sudomer was the first significant clash between Hussites and Royalists. During the battle, it was clear the Hussites had the advantage of terrain. However, the Royalists were not deterred thanks to their vast numerical superiority. Some sources do mention up to 5,000 knights, although, frankly, it is generally accepted they numbered between 2,000 and 2,500. Still, they severely outnumbered the Hussites. Because Brennek died during the fighting, Žižka likely took over command from that point. His victory ensured radical Hussites could remain in Tabor, and it elevated Žižka to one of the rebellion's leaders. The morale boost was spectacular, for it was the first real victory for the Hussites. When Žižka's column arrived at Tabor, it united the Hussites from western and southern Bohemia. But news of the Hussite victory did reach King Sigismund as well. He could obviously not let this happen unpunished. The war was far from over. Thank you so much for watching this video. If there's a topic, battle, or event you would like to know more about, let me know your thoughts in a comment. I would also really like to thank all my patrons and my channel members for their generous support. If you enjoy House of History and you want to support my work, consider joining me on Patreon. For just $1 a month, you will already gain early access to all my videos without any in-video advertisements, and your name will be featured at the end of every video. Don't forget to subscribe. See you next time.